Well, we thank everybody for turning out on such a cold, blustery day today. I will tell you, though, that it's much easier for most of us in the audience to get to the area that we are today than it was for the president trying to land in Columbus last night when it was really blowing. But he managed to make it in, has recovered very nicely from a long trip, and we're very pleased to have him here with us in Worcester today. I think you'll very much enjoy his message. This is one that's grown out of a long history, a long passion of his interest, from visiting many countries, seeing the world from different points of view. And what he will share with you is his perspective of some of the things that will be impacting us in the future. So I think you'll find this very interesting. Now, it's my pleasure to really do an introduction not of the president himself, but of one of our faculty, Dr. Ratan Lal. And we're asking Dr. Lal to introduce the president specifically because one, they are both soil scientists. They really have done some work together, have some similar interest, but also just this week, Dr. Lal was made an adjunct professor at the University of Iceland. So he essentially works for the president, and he has to do a very good job of introduction. Correct? Ratan.
Thank you, Dr. Slack. It's indeed a matter of the greatest privilege, pride, and honor for me to introduce His Excellency, President of the Republic of Iceland, Professor Dr. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson. He is native of northwestern Iceland. Dr. Grímsson studied at the Reykjavik Higher Secondary Grammar School, where he was president, I repeat, president of the school's debating society called The Future, and that shows you where the future led to him. Dr. Grímsson obtained BA and PhD degrees in economics and political science at the University of Manchester in UK. The PhD research was part of the project entitled Smaller European Democracies. The project was directed by Professor Robert Dahl of Manchester and Professor Stein Roken of Norway. Dr. Grímsson then joined University of Iceland, where he became full professor in 1973 and built the social sciences department of the university. His main specialty was the evolution of the Icelandic political system, the theme on which he has written several textbooks and scientific journal articles. Dr. Grímsson had interest in political science right from his college days. He ran for a seat in the parliament in 1974 and held several political offices, including the Minister of Finance from 1988 to 91. Dr. Grímsson served as chair of the preparatory committee for the Council of Europe, North-South, the role of Europe from 1982 to 84. He served as chair and president of the International Association of Parliamentarians for Global Action, called PGA, from 1986 to 1990, and served on its council until 1996. Under his leadership, PGA organized a Six Nations Peace Initiative. He was a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. In 1987, Dr. Grímsson was elected leader of the People's Alliance Party, a position which he held until 1995. Dr. Grímsson was elected the 5th President of the Republic of Iceland on 29th of June 1996 and is currently serving the fourth four-year terms. Dr. Grímsson, as I have the honor to come to know him, is an outstanding politician, a world leader, an icon, a bright light, and sustainable management of natural resources, especially with reference to desertification control and environment quality. He is the first world leader to develop and implement a specific plan to make Iceland an emission-neutral nation. More importantly, he is achieving this noble goal by restoring degraded and desertified lands and ecosystem, not only in Iceland, but also spreading that technology to Africa and other developing countries. President Grímsson's contributions to the global community on climate change and to fostering North-South relations rank him among the top world leaders. Amongst his peers are, of course, our former Vice President Al Gore. President Grímsson's government is presently developing a carbon management center devoted to training and research on desertification control, carbon sequestration, and environmental enhancement. President Grímsson has received numerous prestigious awards and honors. He received Indira Gandhi Peace Prize 1987, and next month he will receive the Nehru Award, the most prestigious award of the Indian government. He received honorary doctorate degrees from his alma mater, the University of Manchester, and from the University of Ås in Norway. And I'm pleased to announce that he will receive the honorary doctorate degrees from the Ohio State University on Sunday, the 13th of December. We will be then very proud to see President Grímsson officially become a Buckeye. President Grímsson has very kindly agreed, and we are very grateful to you, sir, to share his global vision, knowledge, and vast experience by presenting a lecture entitled Iceland's Lessons for World Sustainability, Soil as the New Soldier in Fighting Climate Change. Sir, it is my great honor and privilege to welcome you personally to my home institution, the Ohio Agriculture Research and Development Center of the Ohio State University. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, please join me in giving a very warm welcome and the Buckeye enthusiastic welcome to OARDC Worcester and to Ohio for His Excellency, the 5th President of Iceland, Dr. Grímsson.
Well, thank you very much, Ratan, for this kind invitation, which was far too generous. And also, I want to thank the director for his words of welcome and all of you for being with me here today. I also want to congratulate the town and the university for welcoming me with the greatest evidence of winter I've seen so far, with the bracing cold wind and the snow which greeted me when we came here, because in the last 8 years or so in that part of Iceland where the presidential residence is, we have hardly seen any snow for the last 8 years or so. And since I was brought up in the northern part of Iceland where it snowed heavily every year, I very much felt at home this morning as we were driving from Columbus up here. I know you would perhaps excuse the weather with most other visitors, but for me it's a great joy to be with you here today in these conditions. And especially since a few days ago, the United Nations Climate Change Conference was, as we all know, opened in Copenhagen, convened to discuss the gravest problems now threatening mankind, but above all, to examine the solutions, the advanced technologies, and the framework of cooperation which would allow us in the next years and as soon as possible to rally all countries and all people everywhere, hoping that we would together have the necessary wisdom and also the sense of responsibility to succeed, to act before it is too late. But settling the differences between the emerging economies and the industrialized countries is indeed a formidable task. But I hope that the increased awareness of an immediate threat and the progress made especially by research and scientific discoveries in recent years offer now more hope of succeeding than we had in Kyoto, and Bali a few years ago. For a long time, as we all know, it was an uphill battle to even discuss climate change, because the doubters and the naysayers then had the center stage, especially in high offices in this country and elsewhere. But recently, we have seen a fundamental shift, primarily because the evidence gathered by the scientific community all over the world is now so overwhelming, despite the recent attempt in the last few days to cast some doubts on these efforts. The research on the Arctic and the Greenland ice sheet indicates that the point in the melting process, which only a few years ago was expected even by the scientific community, that we would reach around the middle of this century, around 2040 or 2050, has already, in the last few years, been reached. Global warming is now, unfortunately, several decades ahead of schedule. And in Iceland, we are witnessing this alarming rate by observing our glaciers, how they are melting. Some mountains and valleys that were covered by ice for centuries have now become exposed. And the glaciers in Iceland, which are the thickest, among the thickest on land in the world and the largest in Europe, will, according to our scientists, completely disappear in the beginning of the next century, given even the present rate of climate change. My country can therefore indeed be described as a theater of climate change, because major natural systems are either located within Iceland or in the ocean around my country. We have, as I mentioned, the largest glaciers in Europe, but also, which many people in other countries are not aware of, we have also for over a century struggled to contain the largest desert in Europe, which also is in my country. And then, in addition, the Gulf Stream encircles the island, mixing with the water produced by the melting of the Arctic, creating what can best be described as the motor, which drives the entire global conveyor belt of ocean currents and thereby impacting on the climate everywhere, in Asia, in North America, as well as Africa. But however, Iceland is not only a theater of the processes and consequences of climate change. It can also, fortunately, serve as an inspiration, as an example of how to retard change through comprehensive transformation of our energy systems, which also brings an enormous economic advantage. I'm not going to talk extensively about it here today, but will do so more in a speech in Columbus tomorrow. But during my lifetime, we have transformed the energy system of my country from being, in my youth, over 80% dependent on imported coal and oil, but now 100% of our electricity production and 100% of our space heating is based on clean energy resources. If Iceland can do it, so can every country in the world. But since I visited Ohio 2 years ago, we have seen, fortunately, significant change in the global debate. More now, as we see in Copenhagen, acknowledge that all nations must act in order to prevent global warming, because an increase in world temperature of only a couple of degrees or so would cause disasters. But also, in recent years, we have gained increasing awareness of how our eco-world is in fact a single system, but not separate parts. How developments in one particular area of the ground mechanism of our existence may have hitherto undreamt of consequences in another. The most dramatic contemporary manifestation of this interdependence is the relationship we have come to understand between climate change and the destruction of the soil, and how this indeed constitutes a vicious circle. Land degradation, manifested in the loss of carbon from the terrestrial ecosystem, is one of the major contributions to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And as land loses its cover and vegetation retreats, its capacity, as we all know, to capture carbon is indeed reduced. And this in turn accelerates climate change. Warmer years may result in droughts affecting water resources and an endless number of ecosystems, often furthering the spread also of dangerous diseases. This is the picture. And in the last 3 years, I have had the privilege to have a number of meetings with the leaders of India and China, with President Hu Jintao of China and other leaders of that great country, as well as ministers and other prominent figures in India. And I have observed through this dialogue in the last few years a fundamental shift in the way China and India view climate change. And China is clearly determined, in my opinion, to reduce the pollution, which now erodes the quality of life in the growing urban regions. The emerging middle class in China wants clearly to preserve its health and enjoy the lifestyle and the freshness of the air, which is enjoyed in many other parts of the world. But the Chinese leaders have also discovered that the air pollution in the cities is perhaps the greatest potential source of social unrest. In recent years, there have been annually over 60,000 demonstrations in China, all caused by climate and environmental factors. 60,000 demonstrations in China is not something which we normally associate with that country, but they are absolutely on the radar screen of the Chinese leaders. This might be one of the reasons why in recent months and years they have become much more constructive in the international dialogue on climate change, leading them to decide this year to announce a target of reducing carbon intensity by 40 to 45% by the year 2020, compared to the level of 2005. And in his speech at the UN climate meeting in New York last September, President Hu Jintao stated, I quote, "Global climate change has a profound impact on the survival and development of mankind. It's a major challenge facing all countries. We should make our endeavor on climate change a win-win for both developed and developing countries." Not so many years ago, such statements would have been almost revolutionary from a Chinese leader. But he added that his country had taken steps to tackle this challenge by radically increasing forest coverage and volume, by enhancing the share of non-fossil fuel in energy production, and by improving energy efficiency. China is now fast becoming the leading solar energy country in the world. But just like India, China depends heavily on the water resources in the glacial regions of the Himalayas. They affect fundamentally seasonal balancing, irrigation, food, and hydroelectric production. But there are strong indications that the glaciers in the Himalayas, of which there are thousands, might disappear completely within the next 20 to 30 years, given the present rate, not the increased rate, but the present rate of climate change. Thus, although most of us in Europe and North America would be surprised, thus it would be China and India which could suffer the most immediate and disastrous consequences suffered by any country due to climate change. Their leaders, the leaders of China and India, might argue correctly that it is greatly unfair that the more than 2 billion people, a third of mankind, living in those two countries, should be so severely affected when climate change, correctly, is primarily caused by our economies in Europe and America. The deterioration of the Himalayan glaciers and their water systems is therefore a strong reason for India and China to monitor current and future climate change more closely than ever before, to become active partners, as we are increasingly seeing them doing in the Copenhagen process, in the search for solutions. Because for them, the stakes are indeed, in the next 2 or 3 decades, far higher than for our countries in Europe and North America. It is therefore, in my opinion, not inconceivable that given this climate threat, primarily because of the disappearance of the glaciers in the Himalayas faced by China and India, that these two countries in Asia could, in the next 10 to 20 years, achieve greater CO2 reduction than either we in Europe or the United States would do. And therefore, the common excuse, which we have so often heard, for non-action by Western countries, that China and India are not doing enough, might thus indeed be reversed. And let us prepare for that time, because I believe that sometime during the 2020s, these two Asian countries could indeed be calling on the United States and Europe to match their CO2 reduction. That indeed would be a grave political and economic challenge for us all. It came to my attention a couple of years ago and was confirmed actually here in Ohio in dialogue with the formidable glacial experts at the Ohio State University, that research on the Himalayan glaciers was very limited, and only a few Indian scientists had indeed specialized in glaciology. And I therefore decided, following my visit to Ohio 2 years ago, to initiate a research project aimed at enhancing the monitoring of glaciers in this region. But as we all know, the Himalayas include the borders of powerful countries, and information of this development is, both in China and India and some of the other countries, subjected to military considerations. And as we all know, the principle of guarding information within the military is opposed to what it is, spreading information freely in the scientific world, a great problem. So therefore, that might also be one of the reasons why so little is known about the hydrology of the Himalayas and the need for scientific research in this area, not only on the glaciers, but also on the vegetation, on the land, what happens when the glacier retreat and a new situation in the climate is being created, must become the common project of all universities and research institutions interested in this area. And we should therefore take notice when the entire cabinet of Nepal last week decides to hold a meeting at the base of one of the great glaciers in order to alert the world to what is happening in the small country of Nepal. I have accepted to make, as was mentioned here in Lathal's introduction, a state visit to India next month, when I will attempt to stimulate constructive discussions on how to increase scientific cooperation in this area. Already, Icelandic glaciologists have started a dialogue with some of their Indian colleagues. So notwithstanding the military dimension, I have great confidence and believe that both the Indian and the Chinese authorities would welcome such international cooperation in this area in order to help all of mankind to really understand what's happening. But there are other alarming statistics which also should serve as a wake-up call for us all. The UN Millennium Ecosystem Assessment has ranked land degradation among the world's greatest environmental challenges, pointing out that it threatens not only to destabilize societies, but also to endanger food security and increase absolute poverty in many parts of the world. Deteriorating soil and agricultural land, shrinking vegetation and forests, diminishing supplies of clean water, the threat of growing social and ecological vulnerability, all of these and many others related aspects are not just local or regional difficulties. They are indeed now pressing global issues which must concern us all. We know that the world agricultural land per capita has decreased over the last 3 decades, while at the same time per capita food consumption has increased by approximately 1/6. And at first, it looks like a riddle. How can we be consuming more as arable land is shrinking? Yes, farming is becoming more productive, helped by enhanced technologies studied here and in other places in the world, more efficient irrigation and new fast-growing seeds. But this raises, indeed, fundamental and worrying questions. How much of modern farming is fundamentally unsustainable? How much can we squeeze out of the land without putting too much strain on it? And to invoke an inconvenient truth, how do we tackle the threat of regional but increasingly serious global water shortages? Most experts now agree that the greatest challenge facing China in its economic development in the coming decades is not economic in nature, it's the lack of water. All of these questions must now be put on the priority table of the global agenda. Because for the first time, the world faces a task of immense proportions, so immense that it's almost impossible to comprehend in a simple way. That is the challenge to produce enough food in the next 50 years than in all of previous history combined. I am close to becoming, next few years, 70 years old. So for me, 50 years is not a very long time. And therefore, for all of us together to have to face this task of producing in the next 50 years more food than all previous human history combined is, as I said, almost an inconceivable task to understand and comprehend, not to say to execute. More carbon is stored in soils than in living matter and the atmosphere combined. Soil contains, as we know, 82% of all active terrestrial carbon. A substantial proportion of today's greenhouse gases in the atmosphere originates from carbon and nitrogen compounds from soil. Due to overexploitation of this resource, and further climate change may accelerate the release of carbon from soils, especially in the Arctic. And traveling in the northern part of Russia through Siberia, in northern Canada and Alaska, I have become acutely aware of this possibility. Annually, approximately 2 gigatons of carbon are sequestrated in soil organic matter, 4 times less than the annual amount of carbon released by human activities. A recent study argues that organic matter is generally decreasing in world soils. The percentage of soils in Europe with less than 2.6% organic matter rose from 35% to 42% in the period from 1980 to 1995. And the main reason, it is claimed, is the increase in temperature, and this trend is significantly lowering carbon sequestration in that soil. I recently discussed this challenge with an Icelandic scientist, Professor Kristín Vala Ragnarsdóttir, who was recently appointed as the head of the Faculty of Engineering and Natural Sciences at the University of Iceland. In a review, she points to 2 methods of increasing carbon sequestration in soil. One is to mix different kinds of organic matter, such as charcoal, algae, and mammal and fish bones with the soil. This strategy is inspired by the black soil, or the so-called terra preta found in the central Amazons. It has proved to be exceptionally good for farming and long-term carbon sequestration. And there is evidence which indicates that the prehistoric Amazonians, Indians enriched or even produced this rich black soil. It is a new and fascinating aspect of the global discussion, and whether this can be done on a large scale is indeed a fundamental question discussed very enthusiastically by Al Gore in his new book, Our Choice. One evidence of the changing in the debate where soil projects and the human experience in this area, as well as the science and the research done here at Ohio, is being brought into the picture. The other method which Professor Ragnarsdóttir describes is to mix rock dust with soil with the aim of speeding up the weathering process, which allegedly binds CO2. She argues that there is now evidence that the addition of rock dust may be another so-called low-tech method of reducing CO2 in the atmosphere, since the gas is consumed in the weathering of rocks, which forms the basis of soil formation. This could indeed be relevant in many parts of the world, but it would, in my opinion, require a revolutionary change in our view of and the use of rock dust. My country is proud of its long-standing tradition of land conservation and demonstrates vividly how carbon lost to the atmosphere can be recaptured in soil and vegetation through systematic land restoration programs. A special law was passed 100 years ago dedicated to fighting the Icelandic desert. Sowing and preserving grasslands, planting trees, and nurturing forests have therefore enjoyed popular support in my country for decades. And recently, we decided to add the preservation of wetlands to our agenda. In the past, these endeavors were inspired by practical and economic purposes, and even afforestation was driven in the minds of many people by aesthetic reasons, because they felt the country and the landscape looked nicer with trees than having to watch the barren volcanic territory of their homeland. But in recent years, the need to reduce CO2 emission has added a whole new dimension to our activities. In the past 1,000 years, Iceland may have lost the equivalent of more than 1 billion tons of CO2 through soil erosion and ecosystem degradation, compared to the current annual release of only 5 million tons. And at the Copenhagen Conference, the inclusion of constructive and responsible land use and the recovery of land quality must be a key part of the new international agreement. And it is a priority mission for the Icelandic delegation at the Copenhagen Conference to argue for this inclusion, an inclusion which, unfortunately, is absent from the Kyoto Treaty. I have described briefly how my country provides a unique opportunity to understand the links between human attitudes, human behavior, land succession, and ecosystem developments. And throughout the work of the Soil Conservation Service in my country over the past 100 years, we have been working on nationwide reclamation projects in response to overgrazing and subsequent erosion by wind and water. The project includes local sheep farmers and other land users who were not very enthusiastic some decades ago, but now engaging them in conservation practices on both private, their own, as well as common lands. In addition, Iceland has undertaken a nationwide research project for the IPCC to study carbon sequestration on reclaimed land and has established 1,000 plots throughout the country which will be sampled once every 5 years to document long-term changes in soil quality, which includes the soil carbon stocks. This information and data from related studies will provide the background and the baseline for a comprehensive interdisciplinary project whose results will be of significance for many other parts of the world. The so-called Farmers Heal the Land program, which was aimed at promoting land restoration and sustainable land management, has now succeeded in engaging 25% of the sheep farmers in my country. However, most landowners believe still that land cover changed, and in particular the development of bare patches of soil, is a historical problem, as opposed to a modern-day concern, and that it is driven largely by the land use interacting with natural climatic factors. So we still have a long way to go. Overgrazing is not, unfortunately, seen as a problem by a large majority. In fact, most of them believe, when asked, that conditions have improved over the last 50 years because practices have changed with less use of common pastures and the fact that people have left rural areas and individual farmers have engaged in reclamation work with the Soil Conservation Service. So the paradox is somehow such that the success of our efforts had led a great proportion of the farmers to believe that not additional work is required. So while there have been success, there is often a disjunction between research and the need to transfer the technology to the farmers and the land managers. In my younger years, the Icelandic state had decided to subsidize the draining of wetlands. At that time, they covered large areas of Iceland and made them unsuitable for harvesting or even grazing. Farmers were even given grants to drain them, The aim being to increase the availability of arable land and improve the quality of the pastures. The results in some places was a profusion of ugly drainage ditches which many saw as greatly damaging the pristine landscape of our country. But now we have learned to appreciate the wetlands, recognizing that they are valuable not only for their beauty but also for their powerful binding potential for carbon. The Agricultural University of Iceland is located within an extensive wetland area, encompassing estuaries, rivers, and lakes. And the university now hopes and is actively working towards that the entire campus area of about 1,500 acres will be declared a Ramsar site, or a wetland of global importance. And recently, I participated in opening the Wetland Center at the university's campus. The work done at this university and other institutions of learning has been indeed very valuable for my country. And our research community has had the fortune to work with many distinguished scientists and universities and research institutes in other parts of the world. Thus, Icelandic universities, the main University of Iceland, the Agricultural University, and the university in the north, the University of Akureyri, signed an agreement during Ragnar Laal's visit on an effective exchange of students and academic cooperation, which indeed working so well that now we have made Professor Laal one of our own. But experts from both sides have been involved in many other projects, including the preparation for the productive international conference on soil, society and global change, which was held in my country in September of 2007 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Icelandic Soil Conservation Service. The Ohio State University made a great contribution to this prestigious conference. And together, the team of enthusiastic soil scientists from Ohio and Iceland did a truly remarkable job. And I hope I am not playing down the importance of others if I mention here the name of my friend, Professor Ragnar Laal, who has been, for us in Iceland, like in many other parts of the world, a great inspiration. His outstanding scientific experience, but also his practical mindset and diplomatic skills have been of immense importance. And as he knows, I keep the monumental Encyclopedia of Soil Science, which he gave to me, on a prominent place in the Presidential Library, not only to remind myself, but also my visitors, of the importance of soil preservation and land care. The history of agriculture, since Iceland was first settled by the Vikings around 1100 years ago, is indeed a worthy subject of our attention in the beginning of the 21st century, because it offers many lessons for the present global debate. In the Middle Ages, my nation was fortunate to enjoy what we have often called a glorious period, in which the Icelanders created unique literature, including the world-famous sagas. But however, there were dark elements to this story. The use of land was unfortunately a tragic example of short-sighted exploitation of limited and very vulnerable resources. A story of what might indeed be happening to our world today. The Icelandic medieval literature describes how the country was, when the Viking arrived, covered with woods, from the sea to the mountains. But what followed was desertification on a large scale, due partly to overgrazing and exploitative chopping of the woods. Within the first few centuries, about 80% of the original woodlands had been cleared, and the grasslands of the interior became the desert we know today, the largest desert in Europe. The soil was carried from the highlands down to the lowlands and out to the sea. It is indeed disturbing when we understand how this process of deterioration came about. And it is in that understanding that we can today hopefully seek lessons to do better. The woods were destroyed or burned, with sheep grazing accelerating the process. And the result was, as I have described to you, the creation of the largest desert in Europe. In his remarkable and recent book, Professor Diamond, a book which he so correctly named Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, he discusses this Icelandic case of soil erosion as an illustration of how societies, or we could say, given what we are talking about today, how the world can indeed choose to fail. For centuries, the Icelandic settlers and their descendants certainly did not understand how sensitive the recently settled land was to the agricultural practices which they had brought with them from Norway and other parts of Northern Europe, as many people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America do not understand how the economic practices which we have developed in Europe and the United States can be disastrous for the entire world if implemented on a global scale. The vegetation in Iceland was more fragile than what the Vikings had been used to in their former homelands. And as Professor Diamond argues, they simply did not know how to farm on a volcanic island with such a scanty remembrance of soil. And we can ask ourselves today, do we know how to farm and produce food in the 21st century? And consequently, large regions of my country became victims of the wind, and the soil, as is now happening in all over the world, eroded away, and huge amounts of carbon were released. The Viking immigrants, 1,000 years ago or so in my country, therefore offer us an important lesson. They did not suddenly throw caution to the wind when they settled in Iceland. No, they did not. But they found themselves in an environment which appeared lush and rich and strong and productive, but was in fact fundamentally fragile. Their previous experience could not possibly have prepared them for the challenges ahead, as perhaps our previous experience in the 19th and the 20th century may not have prepared us for the challenges we will face and are now facing in the 21st century. The conservation of soil and vegetation ultimately became an important issue in my country. And this development appropriately began in the last stages of our campaign for independence. And towards the end of the 19th century, people with foresight and vision understood that special efforts were required, and a crucial milestone was the establishment of special agencies for forestry and soil conservation in 1907, only 3 years after the Danish government had agreed to grant Iceland home rule, so enabling my nation to leave the colonial past behind and established authority over its domestic affairs. And people were now enthusiastic to take good care of the land that they could now govern themselves, and were determined to heal the wounds inflicted by their unwitting and short-sighted ancestors. And we could raise the question and the hope that the people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America would have the same foresight and wisdom now to do better than what we could appropriately call their colonial masters have been doing over the last 100 years or so. Land reclamation in the form of cultivating trees and reclaiming grasslands became indeed a popular national endeavor. And gradually, but only gradually, it won the support of farmers as well as city dwellers. The history of land use in my country is, I believe, significant because it can serve as a warning about what is bound to happen when ignorance and greed are allowed to control our conduct. But at the same time, it can be an encouraging tale of visionary people who, through increased awareness, organized what can only be called a resistance campaign against land degradation. In the 13th century, when the bountiful resources of Iceland had been greatly diminished, the country went through a series of local battles which were partly caused by the problems of land wealth and land use. Local battles which, to some extent, we could, in modern terms, describe as civil wars. Environmental challenges can thus often translate into armed conflicts, as are demonstrated by many recent examples of how soil erosion has been the root cause of humanitarian crisis and vicious and tragic ethnic confrontation. And Darfur is but one example. There are scores of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America and elsewhere where the deterioration of the land and the enlargement of the deserts threaten to sow the seeds of severe conflicts in the years to come. And given the present debate in this country and also in Europe, it is an interesting question how a more effective use of the land could indeed perhaps be one of the most effective contributions to peace and stability in Afghanistan. It is important to understand the complex ecological, economic, and social interplay of land use, water resources, energy production, and carbon emission. Increased greenhouse gas emissions will bring higher temperature and, in consequence, more wind. Lack of water will erode the soils in densely populated areas which are highly dependent on traditional agriculture. The Caspian Sea and Lake Chad were two huge water resources which have now more or less disappeared. At the same time, the accelerating melting of the Greenland and the Antarctic ice cap, similar to what is happening, and I have mentioned here today, to the glaciers in the Himalayas and in Iceland, will make the ocean levels rise considerably, washing away excellent farmland soils in many parts of the world, in Bangladesh, in the Mekong Delta, and elsewhere. With increased poverty, social unrest, even warfare, people have very little chance of using their farmland in a sensible and far-sighted manner, reminding us of the armed conflicts that were created in my country in the medieval times, when the treatment of the land during the first centuries had destroyed the opportunities and the possibilities which were there when the Vikings arrived. But these wide-ranging issues can indeed be resolved, but without a sensible land use, the suffering countries will never get close to the rescue. Many nations are now, as I have tried briefly to describe here today, in the footstep of the 10th century settlers in Iceland. Like my ancestors, they and we all have the choice whether to run our agriculture in a sustainable way or not. And the experience of my country should teach us all to make the wiser choice, to aim whenever possible for the sustainable practices. We need to work with the grassroots, with the farmers, with the local communities to make them understand that their own long-term interests lie in such changes. And here again, the experience in my country can be of help. Because, as I have mentioned some decades ago, most of the farmers in Iceland were highly suspicious of these analysis, scientific research, and programs. They wanted indeed to keep on doing what they had always done. But gradually, through our effective democratic dialogue and sustained policies, we succeeded in making the tide turn. And now the farmers are successful partners in reforestation, in land restoration, in soil preservation, and other sustainable projects, so creating a strong foundation for the future food security of my country. This success story in caring for the land reforms has formed the basis for the proposal of an International Year of Land Care, which was put forward at this forum in Iceland in 2007, and has been further evaluated in an interesting paper by Emily Mutoda, which is a fellow of the Icelandic Land Restoration Training Program. A sufficient supply of food must indeed become an increasing global concern, and perhaps in addition to meeting in Copenhagen, the leaders of the world should aim to come together to create what we could call an Earth Charter, similar to the human rights documents that gather our international dialogue and actions today. An Earth Charter which would be a manifesto to summon all stakeholders to tackle the compelling task of enhanced and sustainable land use, to develop what we could call the ethic of land care, accepted by all, farmers, decision makers, city dwellers, land users, entire humankind. Because the quality of the land for food production and water storage is fundamental to our existence, fundamental to world peace. But by contrast, the misuse and the mismanagement, the degradation of the ecosystems and soil erosion and desertification can create global problems in the years to come, which would be almost impossible to tackle. We would have not only one, but many Darfurs and Afghanistans in almost every part of the world. The global community will not be able to achieve goals essential to sustaining our future without a major improvement in the conservation and restoration of the world's soil resources. While demand for the soil services are growing, the problems of unsustainable land use are unfortunately intensifying, getting worse in most parts of the world. And climate change exacerbates land degradation, primarily through, as we know, changes in precipitation and other ways. A creeping environmental crisis is thus affecting a growing proportion of humankind. Reduction in ecosystem functioning, coupled with the erosion of the soils and reduction in soil nutrients and moisture, are a major factor in the reduction of biodiversity in many parts of the world. And this in turn will reduce production, accelerate land degradation, and constrain our capacity for responding constructively to the changes while trying to meet current and future human needs. Up to now, we have increasingly tried to do this by clearing and irrigating more land, converting natural forests to agricultural land, applying more fertilizers. But all of these are unsustainable land use options in the years and the decades to come, and they have fundamental negative consequences for the health of soils, land, and biodiversity. The options are therefore unfortunately narrowing. And this is partly a result of the realization of the effects of global greenhouse gas emissions and the loss of biodiversity, partly due to soil degradation. And these negative trends cannot and must not be allowed to continue. We therefore need a new vision to place soil at the heart of the global political, social, economic, and environmental dialogue. We have many outspoken world leaders and scientists in this area to provide the leadership and the vision, as Professor Ragnar has done at so many occasions, as he did by attending and organizing the 2007 Global Conference in Iceland on this matter. And in my closing speech at that conference, I tried to outline some elements of an action program which could contribute to the solution of these problems. And I want here today to emphasize once again some of the elements in such a global action program. First, the strengthening of the education of agricultural experts from developing countries. Second, the establishment of field laboratories to conduct site-specific research on desertification. Third, by sending experts to suffering locations to examine and give advice on what can be done about land degradation. These envoys could bring to these locations new modes of thinking concerning the selection and the adaptation of land use strategies and new technologies to restore degraded soils and ecosystems, bringing the projects down to the grassroots levels and encouraging active participation by the farming communities, because without active participation by the farmers, we have very little hope of success. Especially bringing these technologies into the villages, which are the homes of more than 1 billion people in the world. Fourth, initiating efforts to back up research efforts on restorative technologies. Fifth, include land use and the restoration of land quality, enhancing the carbon content of the soils as a variable in the system of tradable carbon credits, and using the revenues of that system to restore degraded soils and ecosystems all over the world. Sixth, improving existing programs for graduate research and supporting international networks in the earth sciences. And seventh, encouraging the 4 pillars of modern society, the scientific communities, the governments, the business sectors, and civic associations to combine their resources to build the foundation for sustainable land use. All these efforts could, together with other programs, help to support the struggle against climate change and thus secure a brighter future for all of humanity. And the cooperation with the scientific community here in Ohio has helped in the last few years to further my understanding and my conclusions of how to meet these challenges. And therefore, I'm indeed grateful for the invitation to be with you here today, and I'm looking forward to our dialogue both here, now, and in the coming few days. I have, as you have witnessed, chosen to preface our dialogue with references to the experiences of my country and try to put them in a global context. This mode of thinking must characterize how we approach these challenges and how also we construct, not just in Copenhagen, but what follows, the necessary cooperation framework. The art of human existence has always been and will always be the art of adjustment. We react to something, we must react to something which we did not expect, could not even imagine, and were definitely not prepared for. And as Francis Bacon, the great pioneer of modern science, put it more than 400 years ago, and it is as true now as it was then. He that will not apply new remedies must expect new evils. And with these words from Francis Bacon, spoken 400 years ago, I close my discussion, my lecture here today. Thank you.
I was just letting the President Grímsson know that we're giving him a copy of a book of the history of the Agricultural Research Center here in Ohio. The interesting point of that is that the history really started with the soil science, the study of the soils of Ohio, and then led to other productivity studies. So I think the real challenge, as I hear it, is that we need to produce another volume in another 130 years, and we need to employ many of the thought-provoking ideas that you put before us today in that volume. So thank you very much. President Grímsson said that he'd be very interested if there were a couple of questions that people would like to address. He's always very interested in interacting with the audience. So if there are, we have microphones at the front of the room on either of these two aisles, and we would be happy to entertain some questions. I'll ask one question of you. As you were going through thematically talking about the process that you're putting before us, I thought it was most stimulating as you described the events in your own country and are using that as a model in terms of really enacting the things that you say that we must now do. And it seems to me that one of the most important themes is the fact that you mentioned the idea of continuity and a political continuity. How important is that to being able to execute what you think we must be doing throughout the world?
Well, I believe fundamentally that political continuity can only be created through a democratic dialogue. However well-informed the leaders might be, and however visionary they might be, if there is not a strong democratic community in every nation and every region, we will never get the leadership that is necessary. And let's face it, also, we are all responsible for climate change by our everyday activity. Just by coming here, and I accepted the honor to be given to me by Ohio State University, I had to incur some climate change negative steps. We are all responsible, and therefore we must all come together in this. And I tried to illustrate in my talk that in Iceland for a long time, the farming community was almost entirely opposed to this scientific-based approach to farming and to land use. They wanted to conduct sheep farming basically as they had done for centuries. And it was only through a national dialogue and sustained effort that we managed to transform the national mood in such a way that irrespective of governments, we will continue this process. Similarly, with clean energy, the utilization of geothermal began in Iceland as local initiatives. It was not I must say, unfortunately, not a grand governmental plan to make Iceland 100% clean energy country. I wished it was, but it wasn't. It is the culmination of a series of local initiatives taken in different parts of the country that over a period of 40 years has led to this end result. So the whole lesson is simply this, that the motor which drives this is not a small group of national leaders. It's a transformation of the, to use a classical word, the democratic will of people in every community and everywhere. And there, I believe, the universities have a greater role to play than ever before. Because this transformation must be knowledge-driven, must be based on science. And therefore, the old attitude that somehow within the universities, and this was also prevailing when I was a professor, we refrain from participating in this dialogue. We just do our research. We just do our teaching. We just confine ourselves to the walls of the universities, is the most dangerous fallacy given the seriousness of this challenge. If ever there was a need for a noble, and I emphasize that again, a noble political participation by scientists and universities, not just in their own country, but everywhere in the world, it is now. And that's why I think Ragnar Lal is just a great example, not just because, and I say this even if he is here, not just because he is one of the, if not the greatest soil scientist in the world today, but he has also decided to make every country his field of action. He comes to Iceland and tries to impact our decision-making processes as if he was a voter in my country. I have seen him do the same in Bangladesh and in other parts of the world. The problem is now such that it is both necessary and accepted that we are activists everywhere. That is why Al Gore is more powerful today than when he was Vice President of the United States. And that's the fundamental proof that you don't have to be in office to change the world.
President Ólafur, thank you very much for being here and welcome to Ohio. I know that Iceland is a leader in the development of hydrogen energy, and especially for transportation purposes. But I read the other day that you're also moving to an electric system, and I wonder what that means for the hydrogen development or continuation of that.
So you're also moving to?
Electric cars.
Cars, yeah. Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, now when we have achieved 100% clean energy with respect to economic activity, heating houses, producing power, and so on, the only sector remaining to make us 100% clean energy for all land-based activity is the cars. Well, we still have the aeroplanes and the ships, but we'll deal with that later. So now we have started systematically to deal with the cars in many different ways. Our electric companies are installing programs and doing research and so on and so forth. And we are starting to try to secure the availability of the electric cars, because the main problem was how can we get them? And it is, as I mentioned at lunch, an important evidence for the United States that when we looked around the world, we found out that China, India, and Japan were the countries that could provide us with electric cars. Last month, we signed an agreement with an Indian company to bring 100 electric cars to Iceland as a part of an ongoing process. We couldn't find partners in the United States for this transformation. We had to partner up with Asia in order to make Iceland 100% clean with respect to the traffic on the streets. And we will get there. We will absolutely get there. And I will say again, if Iceland can do this, so can everybody. And I think it is something worth thinking about for this great country, which was the leader in the automobile industry for most of the 20th century, that now on the horizon, as we have found out for practical reasons in Iceland, the great players are coming from Asia.
From listening to your lecture, I was thinking that maybe this trend needs a new title. Instead of global warming, which actually could be welcomed by some people, since it is a soil question, what if it would be called the problem of potential starvation? And that would get their attention much more than global warming. From your talk, it seemed like that would be the end result of where this would lead to.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. I think it has been unfortunate that the trademark for this debate and for this problem has been global warming or climate change. Whereas, more appropriately, it should be the future energy and land use, because that's fundamentally what it is about. It's not about climate change as such. It's about the future of our energy system and the future of our land use. And the climate change will be a byproduct of how we answer that question. And you will get more people positively engaged if you frame the task in this way, as the future of energy and the future of land use. Whether we can change the trademark for this debate, I'm not sure, but I've tried in many of my speeches and dialogue to point out that it was a mistake to talk about climate change, although I do it as I've done here today, because we should fundamentally be talking about the future of energy and the future of land use.
Take one last question.
I was just wondering exactly how many cars are in Iceland?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Sorry. Well, I don't have the total number, but I think we have about 2-point-something cars per family. Well, we are over 300,000 people, but if the point of your question is that then it's easy for us to do it because there are not very many of us, my answer would be this. Iceland is the size of England in terms of territory, and it's a mountainous country with valleys and difficult roads and so on and so forth. So it is a very interesting testing ground for electric cars. That's one of the reasons why Mitsubishi made this deal with Iceland, because they think for commercial purposes, if they can say that the Mitsubishi electric cars are used in Iceland, people believe they can be used anywhere. Which is probably right in terms of marketing strategy. And there are different weather conditions as well. There is, although it's not now, there in other parts of the country heavy snow and so on. And it's also a country where you have to drive long distances from one part of the country to another. But it's also a country with a comprehensive national electric grid, which is a problem for you here in the United States. And so my country is also a good example of the great economic and commercial advantage of having an integrated national electric grid. Yeah, the one there, one of them, yeah.
Speaker, President Grímsson, for a very... I should never get rattle on the microphone.
Thank you. Just one quick question. I'm a student at ATI, and I was wondering, what is your extent of cooperation with the current government of the United States as far as, communications with Barack Obama in terms of affecting more immediate change in terms of energy sustainability and stuff like that, because we get distracted by different things that go on with our government. As you know, it's either taxes or abortion or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was just wondering.
Well, thank you very much for that question. One of the great advantages of this country is how democratic and open it is, despite all its difficulties and problems. And it is therefore accepted in the US that somebody in my position, president of another country, can come in and try to have an impact and influence the policy making and the discussion within the country. I could name many countries in the world where this is not possible, but for diplomatic reasons, I'm not going to get into that hot water. So, in the last 3 or 4 years, I have often come to Washington and other parts of the United States for this purpose. When the Department of Energy had almost closed down its geothermal division, which is kind of, well, what can I call it? I mean, they almost closed down the geothermal division in the Department of Energy. Just think about it. When the US has this enormous capability that it could be more than twice the electric current use in the United States. I decided to go up on the Hill. I met with a great number of senators and people in the House. I even appeared at a hearing of the Senate Energy Committee. I think I'm the only head of state from another country to appear at a Senate hearing, at least in a positive way. But that shows how democratic and open the US is. And Andy Kastner, who, to his credit, he was a deputy secretary in the Bush administration, the Department of Energy, in the last 2 years of the Bush administration, reinstigated the geothermal and the clean energy division of that department. So we invited him to Iceland and so on. On the basis of that, we got an agreement between the US, Iceland, Australia, and New Zealand for this purpose. I also invited Carol Browner, who now heads Obama's effort in the White House. She is the top official in the White House on climate change and clean energy, to come to Iceland more than a year ago. And she traveled over the country and saw some of the areas where we have achieved this. I also met with Senator Obama before he was elected and had a discussion on the Hill with him about clean energy and how the Icelandic experience could be relevant for the United States. And I was impressed when he said, when I become elected president, I will execute these policies. He didn't say if, he said when. And of course, with Hillary and Bill, we have engaged in this dialogue for a long time. So there are a number of players within the Democratic administration, within the Congress, within the Democratic Party, and in the Republican Party, which we have had dialogue with in the previous years. So I'm a strong believer that giving the present leadership in the White House and the overwhelming will of many important people in both the Senate and the House, as well as the leadership by people in different states, including California and others, and cities, including Los Angeles and many other places, we have a reasonable chance of seeing here in the United States a fundamental shift. The problem is that your power companies, your electric companies, have not really geared themselves to this change. Because in order to utilize the existing technologies, and I emphasize that, the existing technologies, you really need a comprehensive transformation of your national electric grid. Without such a transformation, this will be much more difficult. But the prices will be cheaper for individuals, for families, for companies. In business terms, it will be a win-win option for the United States. And it will enable America to at least be a player when China and India are moving aggressively into this area. And therefore, I will continue my efforts in the coming months and years to engage my friends in the administration and in other political quarters in America in cooperation with universities and research institutions to really make America, which it can become, the global leader in this area. I firmly believe so, otherwise I wouldn't be coming so often to the United States because, believe me, my country also has some problems which we need to deal with. So thank you very much.